Today's episode of Wrangell History Unlocked is the Christmas Bombardment, Part 2. December 26, 1869, was one of the shortest days of the year in Fort Wrangell, with less than 7 hours of daylight. The earliest morning light began trickling into the sky around 6 a.m., increasing until sunrise at 8:24 a.m. Christmas Day had turned into a bloody fiasco. There was Angelina Mueller, the post laundress, who now nursed the bloody stump where her right middle finger had been. Inside the guardhouse lay the body of Shawan, the Tlingit man who bit off her finger and was then shot for it. His brother, Istine, still lived, but was badly wounded by a gunshot to his arm. In front of Smith & Lear's general store, the blood stain on the boardwalk was all that remained of Leon Smith's last stand. Leon Smith was still alive, but barely. He lay in the hospital building inside Fort Wrangell, slowly bleeding from the 17 places he was struck by Tk'aachx's shot. Post-surgeon Harry Kirk dressed Smith's wounds and hoped for the best. Throughout the night, under the cover of trees, snow, and darkness, Smith's assailant, Tk'aachx, hid in the woods. Tk'aachx was Shawan's father, and shot Smith in keeping with the tradition of Tlingit law. After shooting Smith, Tk'aachx fled into the woods outside the village. William Tameree's tape-recorded story described the mystery surrounding the location of Tk'aachx. Said Tameree, "Where is he? His wife also did not see him. She only heard her husband killed someone. There was nowhere on the land that they could find him." William Borrow wanted the man who shot Smith and would settle for nothing less. Before the sun rose, Borrow crafted his demands for the village. Turn over Tk'aachx by noon, or the army would fire on the village with cannons. Fort Wrangell possessed 2 12-pound mountain howitzers and a 6-pound field gun. These were the familiar weapons of the Civil War, supported by 2 big wheels, powerful but mobile. To capture a single individual, Borrow was willing to kill everyone in the village. Rosita Worrell, of the Sealaska Heritage Institute, commented on this disparity of American justice in the frontier. In American society, laws are developed around individuals, except as it applied to Indian people. When Indian-white conflicts occurred, the government tended to hold entire Indian tribes or the village as the responsible. The government imposed sanctions or punishment upon the entire tribe or the village. To his terms, William Borrow added that he was also willing to meet with the chiefs of the village. Before the day was over, Borrow would make 3 separate attempts to convey his demand to the Tlingit village leaders, each time unsuccessfully. Borrow's first attempt to deliver this message was at daybreak through an anonymous native woman, whom Borrow trusted implicitly. Said Borrow, "The message I had sent to each of the chiefs by an Indian woman before Lieutenant Lukes left the post, and I am confident that it was delivered." The Daily Alta suggested this woman was responsible for identifying Smith's shooter as Tk'aachx. Borrow's second attempt to communicate his ultimatum to the Tlingit chiefs fell to his second-in-command, First Lieutenant Melville Lukes. Said Borrow, "At daylight in the morning I sent Lieutenant Lukes again to the ranch with a detachment under a flag of truce, with instructions to see the chief of the tribe, Ḳaachx, and demand of him the murderer, the Indians to turn the man over to him there, or failing that, I give them until 12 o'clock that day to bring him in, notifying them that if at that hour the man Tk'aachx, whom I knew to be in the ranch, was not in my custody, I should open fire upon them from the garrison." This was Lukes's second trip to the village in less than 12 hours. Said Lukes, "I proceeded with a detachment of 20 men under a flag of truce to the Indian village to demand that the chiefs should come over to the garrison to settle the difficulty by giving up the murderer of Mr. Smith at or before 12 o'clock p.m. that day, or, failing in this, that the commanding officer would open fire upon the Indian village at the expiration of the time allowed in which the surrender of the murderer was to have been made. Luke's then mentions he spotted Skutdu about 100 yards away from the village, while Tamaree says Skutdu was hiding at this time. Luke's says he did not pursue Skutdu, given the flag of truce and lack of positive identification. For the second time in the past 12 hours, Luke's was back in front of Tawat's home. This time, Luke's used a translator, a man named William Wall, who had been around the Tlingit almost 3 years. Dr. David Douglas Robertson, a linguist, suggests William Wall was, quote, more likely a Chinook jargon speaker than skilled in Tlingit, a notoriously difficult language for strangers. Chinook jargon was a language hobbled together from Pacific Northwest indigenous cultures, useful for trade. According to Luke's, the exchange began like this. I there met Tawat in his war paint and fighting costume, and communicated to him the demands of the commanding officer. Tawat refused both the interview and the surrender of the murderer. He stated twice that if fire was opened upon the village, he would die in his house. I explained to them all that the commanding officer was not angry with all of them, only with the murderer of Mr. Smith, and that if the murderer was surrendered, friendship and good feeling would return. And still earnestly wishing and endeavoring to avoid the necessity of opening fire, I proposed even that the commanding officer might meet the chiefs halfway between the garrison and the village, all parties to the interview without an armed escort. Tawat refused the demands and the modifications which I did assume to make in order to discover the least desire on their part to avoid trouble. Tawat was stiff. The members of his tribe were continually assembling, armed with Hudson Bay muskets, iron spears, pistols, etc., and more than half surrounding me at different times during the interview, and in their eagerness and, judging from the aspect of affairs generally, evidently determined to have revenge for the killing of one and wounding of another Indian the night before. I insisted and repeated to Tawat that by having the interview everything could be satisfactorily arranged, but all this to no purpose. After a talk of about an hour or so with Tawat and his friends, including also Mona Esti, and many of his friends who were within hearing, Ḥaachx, at the head of his own tribe, came over and took part in the interview. Chief Ḥaachx V, Ḳaachx, had dealt with more white men than any other Tlingit leader, save the tribes of Sitka. He is credited with relocating the clan from the south end of Wrangell Island, a place called Ḳaachx, to the north end of the island, in order to trade with the Hudson Bay Company. 2 decades later, when Buck Ťa'quet married Ḥaachx's daughter, Georgiana, Ḥaachx agreed for Buck to be shown where he might find gold up the Stickeen River, kicking off the town's first gold rush. Chief Ḥaachx V lived through changes brought by epidemic disease, alcohol, technology, and now, Melville Luke's. Said Luke's, his manner as he approached was quite self-important. His friends, like Tawat, were, with few exception, armed with flintlock muskets, with thumb and finger ready to cock their pieces and open fire in grand style. With Ḥaachx's friends, added to those already on the grounds, about 1/2 of the men of the Stickeen tribe were assembled. I then informed Ḥaachx of the demands of the commanding officer, but with no more success than with Tawat, with the addition, however, that if the commanding officer wished to see him, he, the commanding officer, could come over to the village to do so. Luke's estimated 1/2 of the men of the tribe surrounded him. Based on Vincent Collier's census, that's about 80 men. Collier also estimated that only half of the men were in a condition to bear arms. This suggests Luke's was surrounded by every able-bodied man in the village. Luke's continues, I told them all again that their village would be destroyed like the Cake village last winter, and that wherever American steamer found them, the same thing would be done again. The bombardment of Cake happened earlier that year. After the Cake people fled their village, the army bombed the village from the sea, then came ashore and burned it to the ground. They forced villagers into the elements in winter to fend for themselves. Here, Fort Wrangell threatened to do the same thing, only it wouldn't end with the village being destroyed. The villagers would be hunted. Then, without any sense of irony, Lukes asked the crowd if anyone has seen a missing corporal. Said Lukes. I also made inquiries in reference to Corporal Northrop, who, it was supposed, had been in the village the night previous, and had not been seen since that night. All said that he had gone. Some said over to the garrison in a canoe, and others said he was drunk in the bushes. The answer may have insulted Lukes. He returned to his threats. I explained to them until I was tired of it that the commanding officer only wished a friendly interview, and that it was but one Indian he wanted, the murderer of Mr. Smith. Ḥaachx indicated that he had no more to say, and believing myself that the whole matter had been fully explained to them all, nothing remained but to return to make my report of the result. The Indians, so far from acceding to the demands in the beginning of the interview, became more and more stubborn as their numbers increased, and instead of facilitating a peaceful settlement of the difficulties, it seemed to me more probable that they might have been increased, by an accident even. I consider that under the circumstances everything possible was done to effect a peaceful settlement, and nothing remained but to execute the threat attached or included in the demand. Lukes returned to Fort Wrangell with his men, except the absent Corporal Northrop, and made a report to William Borrow. This ends Melville Lukes's written report. In all, it covers about 12 hours, beginning with the finger bite, ending here. Borrow commended his second officer for his promptness and decision in carrying out the instructions given him, entitle him to the greatest praise. It is not clear that Melville Lukes improved the situation. As the officer in charge, he bore the responsibility for the botched arrest of Shawan, as much as his story attempted to remove responsibility from any one individual. And even Lukes acknowledged his second visit to the village may have made things worse. He could not even secure an interview with the chiefs, even after threatening to destroy their village. It was a cold rebuke. The Tamaree tape recording includes a third and final attempt by William Borrow to communicate with the leaders of the village. It does not appear in the officers' reports, but it is mentioned in the Daily Alta, which wrote, Another effort was made by Lieutenant Borrow to prevent hostilities by sending over a friendly Indian, but without success. Tamaree described the friendly Indian. The salmon cannery. It was big and long. There was a man named Ḳaachx who lived there, who understood the English language and came from Canada. Ḳaachx serves as a go-between for several rounds of conversations, walking about 3/4 of a mile each way, between the fort and Ḥaachx's house, said Tamaree. He was called. Go to Ḥaachx, he was told. Say to Ḥaachx to send his partner to me. This man that murdered is dealt with. Ḳaachx walked back. He told the high-ranking officer what Ḥaachx said. Could you go to him, Ḥaachx, and ask him what he thinks of the one taken down by the name of an.áak'w, the man who gave them food? An.áak'w was a reference to Leon Smith. When Ḳaachx presented this question to Chief Ḥaachx, Tamaree says the chief responded, This does not have anything to do with me. There is no former in-law here. This does not have anything to do with me. Borrow's 3 attempts at communicating his demands with the Tlingit leaders had failed. The chiefs snubbed his offer to meet and defied his ultimatum. Borrow was convinced the chiefs knew where Tk'aachx was. According to Tamaree, Tk'aachx was hiding at this time, placing the chiefs in an impossible situation. Perhaps Borrow thought his extreme threat would prove leverage to bring the chiefs to the table. If so, it had failed. Tamaree's narrative tells what happened next. This is when the news came. Ḥaachx's house will be shot, and Tk'aachx's house also. It will be shot, and it will be blown up, it is said. This is when they ran. This point, the one Ḥaachx sits on, this point they ran on the other side. From the fort, William Borrow and his men could see the people fleeing. He interpreted it as a sign of aggression, writing, At 12 o'clock no signs were made of any disposition on the part of the Indians to comply with my orders, but their intentions to fight were made evident by the numerous persons engaged in carrying their goods to what they considered places of safety. William Borrow's 12 o'clock deadline came and went in silence until 2 p.m., when the army commenced the cannon fire. Tamaree and Borrow agree. The first house to be shot was the house where Skutdu lived. With each blast, the sound would have bounced off the water, echoing down the channel, rumbling like thunder. In a an.áak'w clan house on Ţaachx Island, a young Matilda Paul lay face down on the ground as the cannonballs flew overhead. She was only 6 years old. In his study of the bombardment, Dr. Zachary Jones estimates that the Army fired an artillery round every 10 minutes. The villagers possessed no heavy artillery to match the Army. Instead, they launched a guerrilla campaign. Fort Wrangell sat along the coast at the base of Mount Dewey. At only 400 to 500 feet high, it is more hill than mountain, covered with trees and brush. From the summit, you could look down into the walls of the garrison. Tlingit fighters positioned themselves among the thick forestation of Mount Dewey and opened fire on the fort, wrote William Borrow. Later in the day, fire was opened on the gun detachments from the hills in rear of and commanding the post, but fortunately without effect. This was replied to from the upper windows of the hospital, and, in connection with a few rounds of canister in that direction, soon drove them away. Canister was a mainstay of the Civil War battlefield. Up to this point, Borrow used solid shot, a molded ball of metal. It could punch a hole in a building, or it could hit the ground just before a target, spraying deadly fragments into the air. Canister shot was a container of small pieces, such as ball bearings, or, in desperate times, pieces of scrap metal. When fired, the canister disintegrates, spraying high-velocity fragments across a wide area. Here, under attack from targets he could not see, William Borrow deployed canister shot into the woods of Mount Dewey. After 2 rounds, the firing from Mount Dewey stopped. The fort continued to bombard the village. Tamaree described the reaction in the Tlingit village like this. That which is grieved, cried over, sounded over the land. The house was ripped apart when the cannon hit the house. After that, our leader of the community, Ţaachx, was bombarded. Ţaachx's house was fired on, and it was missed because as the cannonball was going through the air, it cooled and fell off to the side. At this time, the Tlingit people were in great fear. This rain never stopped or slowed down. The sun began setting at 3:19 p.m., getting fully dark at 5:42 p.m. William Borrow wrote, "Firing was kept up on their part all of the afternoon, and a slow fire from the 6-pounder gun on the village was maintained until dark." According to Tamaree, William Borrow did get his requested interview, but it came after dusk. While Borrow says nothing about it, 2 newspapers, the Daily Colonist and the San Francisco Chronicle, mention this evening rendezvous. The Colonist wrote, "Towards evening, one of the chiefs approached the garrison bearing the flag of truce. The firing was suspended." Tamaree described what led up to this encounter. Now, Chief Ţaachx, who is the head chief, says, "An.áak'w, we are going to the fort. We will talk to the white chief. The soldiers have killed 2 of our men. We have killed 1 of theirs. We will take 1 soldier, and we will kill him, and then everything will be even." Ţaachx was plenty mad. Ţaachx is all dressed up like the soldiers. He has a uniform with gold bunches on his shoulder, and he has a long sword at his side. He has another soldier suit, so he makes an.áak'w put it on, and they go to the fort. They march along the beach up to the fort. The gates are closed, but they tell the sentry they want to see his chief. The captain says, "Let them come in." With only an.áak'w as witness, Chief Ţaachx V and William Borrow faced each other. William Borrow would never write about this encounter, said Tamaree. In the captain's office, the captain says for them to sit down, but Ţaachx says no. The captain then says, "What do you want, Ḥaachx?" Ḥaachx says, "One man, your man who killed my friend Siobhan, and then I will give you Skutdu who killed Smith." Chief Ḥaachx offered a shrewd bargain. Ḥaachx was willing to turn over Skutdu on one condition. Ḥaachx wants the man who killed Siobhan. It is unclear if Chief Ḥaachx knew exactly who killed Siobhan, but, according to Tamaree, Borrow's reaction is nothing less than astonishing. The captain says nothing. He sits and thinks. After a while he says, "Ḥaachx, wait a while. Our law says we must have the man who killed Smith, but you go home. I will think it over." Ḥaachx and Tawat go home then. According to Tamaree, William Borrow seriously considered the request. If the man responsible for Siobhan's death was Melville Lukes, then Borrow may have considered the problems such an exchange could solve. For the rest of the night, Fort Wrangell's cannons lay quiet. Somewhere in the hills around the village, Skutdu hid. He contemplated how much longer he could hide, and how much more his village could take. Chapter 7, December 27th. Tamaree and Borrow tell two very different stories of Monday, December 27th, but at the end of the day, they both arrive at the same outcome. Borrow's story starts first at daybreak, said Borrow. "They opened on the garrison from the ranch with musketry, which was immediately replied to, and seeing that they were determined not only to resist, but had become the assailants, I resolved to shell them, but having only solid shot for the 6-pounder, and the distance being too great for canister, I still continued the fire from that gun with shot, and from the mountain howitzer with shell. The practice was excellent." The use of shells was an escalation in Borrow's arsenal. A shell was basically a flying bomb. A gunner lit a separate fuse inside the shell, the cannon fired, and, timed correctly, the shell exploded at the target. Wrote William Borrow. And after 4 shells had been fired, 2 bursting immediately in front of the houses, and 2 solid shots just through the house of the principal chief, Ḥaachx, a flag of truce was seen approaching the post, and firing on my part ceased. The flag of truce bore a message from Ḥaachx that he and the other chiefs wished to talk with me, and I replied that I would talk with them in the garrison, but that the murderer must be brought in, for without him, talk was useless. Soon after, the chiefs were seen coming over, and a party behind them with the murderer, who was easily recognized by his dress. Just as they were leaving the ranch, a scuffle, evidently prearranged, took place, and the prisoner escaped, and was seen making for the bush, no attempt to rearrest him being made. The chiefs on their arrival at the garrison were received by myself and the other officers, and a conference ensued. They were then informed that until the murderer was brought in, no terms would be extended to them, that, on that basis alone, I would treat. The next bit of Borrow's story does not appear in either of Tamaree's stories, even though it involves Tlingit people. Borrow arranged a compromise with the village leaders, one that even Borrow describes as taking hostages. Said Borrow, "Finding me determined to have the man at all hazards, they then asked what time would be given, and stated that as proof of their good intentions, they would surrender to me the mother of the murderer. I informed them that they must, as proposed, bring me the hostage at once, and in addition, the sub-chief of the tribe to which the murderer belonged, the head chief being absent up the Stickeen River, and that, if the murderer himself was not in my possession by 6 o'clock the following evening, I would open on them and destroy the entire ranch, together with its occupants. This closed the conference, and during the afternoon of the same day the woman and the sub-chief were brought in and placed in confinement." With no other source mentioning these hostages, The Daily Alta newspaper did write about a conference between Borrow and the Tlingit chiefs, saying, "And after some conference, finding the commanding officer was determined to have the murderer, faithfully promised that if they did not, fire would be reopened the next morning and the ranch destroyed." Tammeri's story of December 7 does not include anything about a daybreak skirmish, a failed surrender, or an exchange of hostages. Tammeri starts the day of December 27 with a furious Chief Ḥaachx. Said Tammeri, "The next day comes and the captain has said nothing. Then Ḥaachx gets mad again. He is very mad. He goes to an.áak'w's house. This time he does not go in. He just kicks the door open and says, 'an.áak'w, come with me. We will go take a soldier and kill him. Are you going to do nothing?' But an.áak'w, who is a very smart and peaceful man, says to Ḥaachx, 'Brother, our chief, let them go. They are a big dog. We are only a little dog. If we take a soldier and kill him, they will kill all the Wrangell people. Let them go, my brother.' Ḥaachx gets more mad. He slams the door. 'You coward,' he says. Ḥaachx wants to fight the soldiers." Tammeri then tells the story of the last journey of Ť'áak'w, who comes down from the woods, ready to surrender, and says a long farewell through the village. In the 1940 Sentinel story, Tammeri said, "That day Ť'áak'w comes down out of the woods. For 2 nights he has been hiding, nothing to eat, nothing to keep him warm. He has heard the guns of the fort firing on the Indian village. He is going to give himself up. He goes around to different houses of the villages. He says to his friends, 'Let us smoke. I am going to die. I am going to give myself up to the soldiers.' He goes to his brother-in-law Xustax's house, and he says, 'Let us eat our last meal together. I want to eat here before I die.' Ť'áak'w started at one end of the village, closest to the fort, and walked along the bay, taking him further from the fort out to Xustax's house. Along the way, he witnessed the devastation brought by the cannons. According to Tammeri, Ť'áak'w said, "I went back. I went through Ḳaachx. Things were coming undone. I wondered if this would lead to a mistake. I was troubled in spirit." This is where a young William Tammeri and Ť'áak'w crossed paths. "I ran really fast to my grandfather's place. 'The man that killed someone will be coming here. Prepare the boat. Fishing. His father-in-law, they are putting a box down for him.' He walked in with his gun. 'All ready, and for the final time I have come to you anyway, for you to see me. I will be transported to the other side. I don't want the community to be punished because of me. Truly I am placing this on myself.' Ť'áak'w knew he would die. He knew the only thing that could save the village and everyone's lives was if he turned himself in. Ť'áak'w planned to surrender himself to save the village, but first he would have his last meal. When he was finished, he boarded a canoe, handed over his gun, and took the voyage across the mouth of the harbor from Xustax's Point to Fort Wrangell. This is where Tammeri, Borrow, and the newspaper agree. Ť'áak'w turned himself in after the dark of December 27. Tammeri describes an officer watching Ť'áak'w with a telescope. Said Tammeri, "He saw them. He then saw a canoe. He recognized it clearly. When the canoe came ashore, he gave one instruction regarding the door. The door swung open only one way. Ť'áak'w is walking right there. An ancient name of the past was his name. He reached out and took his hand. He was being taken to... He was immediately led to the jail. It's a fort. It's a fort. He was locked up. The people were weeping, crying. This is the way of the Tlingit. His family was feeling horrific about him. A high, loud groan cry. Leg-foot shackles were placed upon him. There would be no more shots in the conflict. The firing was over. But William Borrow was not done. In the late night hours, with his prisoner secured, William Borrow issued Order No. 76, the court-martial trial of Ť'áak'w for the murder of Leon Smith. Chapter 8. Justice. William Borrow appointed 4 white men to the jury. Himself, First Lieutenant Melville Lukes, Post Surgeon Henry Kirk, and, the only civilian on the jury, William King Lear, the business partner of the late Leon Smith. Borrow ensured his trial and punishment would have an audience. On December 28, Borrow had the 5 chiefs of the village attend the trial. He said, "It is then announced that it is the will of the officers and citizens present during the trial that the prisoner, the Indian Ḳ'ātw', at midday December 29, 1869, shall be hanged by the neck until dead, in the presence of the troops, citizens, and the 5 Stickeen chiefs, and that he should remain hanging until nightfall, when his friends could remove the body." The jury found Ť'āak'w guilty. Before he left his trial, Borrow reports that Ť'āak'w accepted his fate. Said Borrow, "The prisoner, upon hearing this, replied, very well, that he had killed a Tyee and not a common man, that he would see Mr. Smith in the other world, and, as it were, explain to him how it all happened, that he did not intend to kill Mr. Leon Smith, particularly. Had it been anyone else, it would have been all the same." On December 29, 4 days after the Christmas party that sparked it all, Fort Wrangell hosted Alaska's first execution by the United States. Tamaree says, "In the fort yard the soldiers have built a gallows. As soon as they have Ť'āak'w, the captain sends word to the Indian villages. He invites all the people to come and see how they hang a man." In his tape recording, William Tamaree describes how the Tlingit village reacted. The story was told within the community. "Ť'āak'w will be hung on a tree," is what is being said. "Maybe I will not watch it, see it. It was being built. There was a very high porch. It was finished the next morning for his punishment. People were weeping over Ť'āak'w. When the time came, it was morning. Okay, he was told. He saw it. His reign was over there." In the 1940 Wrangell Sentinel, Tamaree describes how the execution of Ť'āak'w unfolded, with a last-ditch attempt to give him a chance to escape. Ť'āak'w is a composer. He sends word for his mother to bring him his dancing hat so he can sing and dance once more before he dies. His mother brings the hat. She is crying. She has put a knife in his dancing hat, hoping that her son can kill the men who want to kill him. But when the soldiers give Ť'āak'w his dancing hat, the knife is gone. Ť'āak'w puts on his dancing hat, and he dances and sings a song he has composed. As soon as he is finished, he gives his mother his dancing hat. From the Tamaree tape. "He is walking, slowly walking. He went to the side. He walked right to the stairway. There was no footing there. This is the song he always used. He danced to this. He walked up to the scaffold. Only the hangman was there. He had a black knife. The high officer spoke, asking, 'Will you not speak?' 'What should I say? I killed him. I killed him. For killing my son.'" From the Wrangell Sentinel. "He turns and walks stiff and straight up the steps to the platform where the soldiers were waiting. The soldiers started to put a cloth over Ť'āak'w's face. They have the rope ready. But Ť'āak'w will not have a cloth put over his face. He tears the cloth away. The soldiers put the rope around his neck. Everything is quiet except for Ť'āak'w's mother. She is crying, and Indians are standing around in the rain looking very sad. Ť'āak'w is their brother." The following piece of information about Ť'āak'w's execution appeared nowhere in the official reports, but it is contained in the Daily Colonist and San Francisco Bulletin. According to the Tamaree tape, a cloth bag was being placed over his head. He beat the man backward with his hand. He jumped into the eye of the noose with his head. The San Francisco Bulletin described it like this. "When the noose was placed around his neck, he asked if all was ready, and receiving an affirmative answer, jumped from the scaffold before the drop fell." Borrow says the execution passed off without accident, while Tamaree's tape says Ť'āak'w struggled for maybe an hour. Per Borrow's orders, Skutdu's body remained hanging from the gallows until sunset, around 3 hours after the execution began, said Tamaree. At this time he was taken down. His father stepped out from the people. I do not want my son to be laying here. It is okay for me to make his coffin for him. It was so. They called for the opposite moiety, as they are called. Raven and wolf we are. He called for the wolf clan. According to the Daily Alta, at this point, the army also turned over the body of Shawan to the Tlingit village. There is a component of the trial and execution that Borrow, Tamaree, and the newspapers agree on. The execution was intended to send a message, said the Daily Alta. The Indians are now quiet and thoroughly understand that they must be governed by the military that protects them, said William Tamaree on his tape. May they all come here for sure. The commander of the army was saying this in the house. When they see how Skutdu died, the Tlingit people will not do this again. The way a white man kills people, this is the way they treated people. This is what was being said by the commanding officer. In a coda to his written report, Borrow made his message clear. In conclusion, I can only say that, though regretting that extreme measures had to be resorted to, yet under the circumstances I consider nothing else would have accomplished the objective in view, that of bringing Mr. Smith's murderer to justice, and reducing the Indians to a state of subjection to the United States authority. Everything is now quiet, and I have no reason to anticipate any future trouble. Yet my vigilance is not remitted, nor will it be, as I have no confidence in any promises made by Indians. They have shown their hostile feelings in this instance, and it is only through fear and the knowledge that any crime committed by them will meet with prompt punishment that will keep them in proper subjection. Borrow's execution of Skutdu had the opposite effect. Decades later, when the Wrangell Sentinel published William Tamaree's story, it did it under the headline, Skutdu, Hero in Native Version of 1869 Battle. The last sentence of Borrow's report reveals Borrow's great wish. I would also request that the 30-pound parrot gun asked for in my last requisition may be sent to me at as early a date as practicable, for, had that gun been in position, I think 2 percussion shells would have brought the Indians to terms. Antietam was the bloodiest day of the Civil War, and it didn't even have a 30-pound parrot gun. This was a huge weapon that you might find on a warship, drastically bigger than anything inside Fort Wrangell. William Borrow needed someone to blame for furnishing alcohol to the Indians. Stanley Ray Remsburg, writing in The United States Administration of Alaska, tells what happened next. Borrow punished 2 prospectors named John Casson and James Hollywood, and Frederick Stahl, a discharged soldier, who had supplied the drink to the Indians. He held them ultimately responsible for the deaths and believed that the full penalty of the law should be meted out to them. Borrow arrested all 3 on December 28, confining as well 3 native witnesses against them. A report on prisoners in Alaska identified these inmates. The liquor procured by Indians from these men was in all probability the immediate cause of recent difficulties at Fort Wrangell, which resulted in the killing of 1 white man and 2 Indians, and the wounding of others. All that was left was for Borrow, Lukes, and Kirk to submit their final reports. Lukes wrote 1,930 words, covering only the 12 hours from the finger-biting incident up to the moment the bombardment began. Borrow wrote less, only 1,748 words, to describe the events of the several days. Post Surgeon Henry Kirk's report was only 56 words. Alaska historian Bob DeArmond would later call this a masterpiece of brevity. Wrote Dr. Kirk, I have the honor to report as the result of the late Indian trouble. 1 white man, Mr. Leon Smith, killed. 1 Indian killed. 1 white woman, company laundress, finger bitten off. 1 Indian severely wounded by gunshot fracture of the right humerus. 1 Indian hung. I am, sir, very respectfully, your obedient servant, H. M. Kirk. Kirk's report told no lies, but it failed to tell the truth. He let Borrow and Lukes go unchallenged. Just after the New Year, General Davis received the reports of the 3 commissioned officers from Fort Wrangell. He acted quickly. On January 5, General Davis relieved Henry Kirk as post surgeon. When Kirk's replacement arrived in Fort Wrangell on January 10, Kirk received instructions to leave Alaska and report to headquarters in San Francisco. Henry Kirk kept his career, but never came to Alaska again. January 10 was also a big day for Benjamin Harnish, the prisoner inherited 16 months before, when Battery I assumed the fort. Harnish languished 16 months in confinement, awaiting his trial for desertion. He was likely confined in the guardhouse, where bodies were taken, Skuddu spent his last night, and other events played out. On January 10, 1870, Benjamin Harnish was restored to duty without a trial and then discharged. The desertion charges simply disappeared. He was free to go, no questions asked. General Davis wrote that he visited Fort Wrangell, called a meeting of the principal chiefs of the tribe, and found their version of events agreed in, quote, all essential points with the officers' reports. General Davis included a line in his report that Skuddu, quote, was more or less under the influence of liquor, a statement not supported by either Borrow or Lukes' reports. Newspapers would report it as fact. In Washington, D.C., the Secretary of War received the written reports, along with General Davis's glowing endorsement of his officers' conduct. Already, newspapers along the West Coast published accounts of the bombardment. Alaska was shrouded in mystery. The public was hungry to know more about the village in this place the newspapers called Wrangell. And Vincent Collier was ready, with stories to tell. Chapter 9. Fallout. One of the first newspapers to report on the bombardment was Victoria, British Columbia's Daily Colonist. The story moved down the coast, showing up in California before the end of January. Notices of Leon Smith's death appeared in papers in the South and the North. On February 19, 1870, Harper's Magazine ran a full page of Vincent Collier's watercolors of Fort Wrangell and an.áak'w, alongside a stern rebuke of William Borrow, stating, "The villagers, Mr. Collier thinks, will now be afraid to occupy their houses again for the winter, and will be greater sufferers by this act of the commandant." The inhabitants were quiet, honest, and well disposed towards the whites, and it is very much to be regretted that the commandant of the post should not have been more judicious in his treatment of them. In March, the United States Senate passed a resolution asking the Secretary of War to investigate the event being called the Bombardment of Wrangell. Who could write such a report? Who had information about the Indian village? Who had even seen the place? Vincent Collier accepted the job, with 1 month to do it. It took 1 month just to travel to Alaska, putting it out of reach. Tragically, this means Collier's report included no interviews with Tlingit witnesses to the bombardment. Instead, Collier combined the officers' reports with what he collected in Fort Wrangell just 2 months before the bombardment. By the middle of April 1870, Congress had the Collier report in its hands, and it was brutal. In his introduction, Vincent Collier laid the blame squarely at the feet of the U.S. Army. The military reports showed this bombardment was the result of a wanton and unjustifiable killing of an Indian named Shawan by Lieutenant Lukes, the second officer in command of the post. This Indian, who was intoxicated, had severely bitten a woman's finger. The arrest of such a man as this is any day effected by 2 or 3 ordinary policemen in our cities with perfect ease and quietness. Collier did not challenge the facts in the officer's reports. Instead, he reached into his trove of information collected in Fort Wrangell to address the abuses he personally witnessed. Collier told the story of catching hundreds of gallons of distilled spirits coming into Fort Wrangell, marked for the officer's use, and how William Borrow only acted because Collier pressed him. Collier also told about encountering the Tlingit man, badly beaten in front of Leon Smith's store, and Borrow and Lukes's ambivalent reaction. Collier held nothing back, writing, "Nowhere else that I have visited is the absolute uselessness of soldiers so apparent as in Alaska. The soldiers will have whiskey, and the Indians are equally fond of it. The free use of this by both soldiers and Indians, together with the other debaucheries between them, rapidly demoralize both." Collier published a letter from William Duncan, the missionary founder of Metlakatla. In polite but clear language, Duncan let loose. "The blood of poor Captain Smith, lately shot at Fort Wrangell, lies, I am sorry to say, at the door of the military authority there, while both Indian and soldier are reciprocating their vices, and both being plunged into utter ruin. The accounts I have received from time to time of the conduct of the soldiers in the Indian camps of the coast of Alaska are truly shocking." Vincent Collier published a letter from Harry G. Williams, who visited Fort Wrangell about the same time as Collier, and who got to know Post Surgeon Henry Kirk. In private quarters, Kirk regaled Williams with stories about the ill treatment of natives by the Army, the alcohol, venereal disease, and disrespect. According to Williams, Henry Kirk knew exactly who was to blame. "I regret to say that men cannot be blamed for following the example set by their superiors, the consequence of which is, the Indian women become mere concubines, at the will of those whose duty it is to try and elevate and not degrade them. These women are never known to seek any such degrading intercourse, but permit it for the pecuniary gain it affords them. Justice, honor, and manhood point the finger of scorn and cry shame to such men with virtuous, noble wives and children, even to stoop to such acts." Kirk is clearly alluding to William Borrow. Melville Lukes was a bachelor. William Borrow had a wife and children. In private, Kirk talked frankly about the Army's treatment of the natives. In his report, Kirk revealed nothing. The prize piece of Collier's research may have been a letter from the late Leon Smith, written just weeks before he was shot by Skutdu. Smith admitted he knew nothing about any other tribe of Indians in Alaska, but this tribe around Fort Wrangell was quiet and well disposed to the whites. Every story Collier had about Leon Smith involved alcohol in some way. Leon Smith's voice from the grave added another testament to Collier's report. Collier included letters from several others, all echoing the same point. The Tlingit are smart, industrious, and eager to trade. Published in April 1870, the Collier report exposed the Army's roughshod management of Alaska, its indulgence and vice, and its morally corruptive effect. Newspapers published complete tracts, including Collier's blame of the commanders in Fort Wrangell for the entire bombardment. 1 month later, the Army ordered William Borrow to report to Sitka, where he stayed for 2 months, leaving Melville Lukes in charge of Fort Wrangell. When Melville Lukes became ill in July, Borrow returned on July 14 to reassume command. Melville Lukes was sent to San Francisco, never to return to Alaska again. Then, in August 1870, the Army made it official. Battery I was ordered to vacate Fort Wrangell and report to Sitka. No replacements would be coming. On September 27, 1870, Battery I cleared out its shelves, tents, stores, and ordnance. The group boarded the steamer Newburn and set course for Sitka. The Army was done with Fort Wrangell. And the Army was also done with William Borrow and Melville Lukes. Lukes was honorably discharged on December 10, 1870, using a new rule that allowed the Army to discharge officers against their will. He was 29. Borrow's discharge came a few weeks later, on January 2, 1871, just days after the one-year anniversary of the bombardment. There would be no presidential reprieve this time. He was out for good. He was 34. The Army's experiment in Fort Wrangell had been costly, cumbersome, and, in the end, unnecessary. Chapter 10. Epilogue. Angelina Mueller survived the loss of her finger. She had more children, including one born in Sitka in 1872. She passed away in 1881 at the age of 40. Frederick Stahl, John Casson, and James Hollywood, the men charged with supplying the alcohol that was the immediate cause of all the troubles, were let go. Stahl was let go quickly, but Casson and Hollywood waited months for their trial, eventually securing a deal to get out of jail on April 1, 1870, so long as they agreed to leave Alaska forever. William Borrow personally ensured they left on the southbound mail steamer. William King Lear went on to become one of Wrangell's pioneer legends. When the Army left Fort Wrangell, it placed William King Lear in charge as caretaker. 1 year later, King Lear purchased the fort for $600, the sole bidder. He turned the hospital building into a dance hall. When the Army returned a few years later, it reclaimed the fort over King Lear's protests. When the Army left again, it retired King Lear's dance hall for good and handed the building over to Amanda McFarland, the Presbyterian missionary, to run a boarding house and school for young Native girls. King Lear lived in Fort Wrangell long enough to see it incorporate as the city of Wrangell in 1903. He died in 1915 at the age of 83. In 1881, West Point published a roll of its alumni. It wrote, Melville R. Lukes, class of 1864, history since 1870 unknown. After he was forced out of the Army in December 1870, Melville Lukes returned to Martinsburg, New York, his hometown. He died 2 years later in 1872, just a few days before his 31st birthday. In recent times, the Tlingit rattle he acquired sold at auction for $48,800. The Tlingit pipe he acquired is appraised between $60,000 and $90,000. Both items are listed by Bonham's auction house as property of various owners. After the Army discharged William Borrow, he moved his family to California, where he went by the name Captain Borrow. By 1874, he worked in Los Angeles as a ticket agent for the Pacific Mail Steamship Company. In June, he was fired, arrested, and charged with 6 counts of embezzlement. The prosecution ultimately abandoned the case. Borrow was a free man, but out of a job. He got into road work, bidding on city contracts for street repair work. He once lodged a protest when he lost a bid to a man who accidentally bid on the job and won. Another man accused Borrow of performing, quote, improper work on grading. By the end of 1874, Borrow was hired as an agent of the commercial insurance company, but by 1878, things started to come apart. Borrow and his wife were sued, and in August 1878, a judge ordered their 2 plots of land in Santa Monica and the buildings thereon to be seized and sold at auction. The next month, a notice appeared in the newspapers disavowing Borrow as an insurance agent. It read, "The public is hereby notified that William Borrow, better known as Captain Borrow, has no authority to solicit insurance, take application for renewals, make collections, receipt for premiums, or perform any other business for the companies for which I am agent. And any business done by him in relation to said companies will be repudiated by me. Edward Leake, Los Angeles." Around the end of the century, Borrow found appointments to boards of several organizations, including a church. But it did not last. On September 17, 1901, the San Francisco Examiner published the headline, "Borrow's Borrow Ends in Sorrow." It read, "William Borrow was arrested yesterday on a charge of obtaining money under false pretenses made by the Bank of California. Borrow obtained money from the bank during the past year on 4 notes aggregating $3,600 and gave as security credits with large corporations and firms, which he said had been approved by various concerns. The bank readily loaned him the money, as he was well known. When the notes matured, Borrow failed to meet them, and the bank attempted to recover on the collateral. It is alleged as the basis of the warrant that all accounts were spurious, and that the names signed to them were either fictitious or forgeries. He would not discuss his dealings with the bank." In 1908, William Borrow passed away at the age of 73 in San Francisco. Chief Shakes V, Ḳaachx, lived another 8 years after the bombardment. When he died, he was photographed lying in state, wearing his clan symbols, surrounded by his artifacts of cultural patrimony. His gravesite in Wrangell sits prominently on a hill overlooking Wrangell Harbor, directly east of Shakes Island. William Tamaree lived out his years in the town that had been his boyhood home. He married Tilly Paul Tamaree, who was also in the village during the bombardment. Tilly's grown sons, William and Lewis, were active in the Alaska Native Brotherhood, and Tamaree often lent his clan knowledge in support of Alaska Native ancestral claims. William Tamaree passed away in 1956. In February 2020, Air Force Lieutenant General Thomas A. Bussier, commander of the Alaskan Command, met with Alaska Native leaders to discuss the legacy left from the bombardments of Ḳaachx, an.áak'w, Ḳaachx, and an.áak'w. Said Bussier, "If not now, when? And if not us, who? The relationship between the Alaska Native community and the Department of Defense is strong, and it has been strong for decades. I think, just out of mutual respect and honoring of their traditions, I think it's worth the efforts." Wrangell History Unlocked is produced by Ronan Rooney. Music from today's episode was performed by Mary Rooney on an